Hey, we are live, and I have a atheist with me from the Presuppositionalism is Wrong group. Is it okay for me to use? Do you want me just to call you Ben, or is
That's
it okay to say
fine.
your full
Yeah,
name?
that's fine.
I have Ben with me from Presuppositional Apologetics is Wrong. It's a Facebook group that has a lot of atheists that are pretty convinced that they have soundly refuted presuppositional apologetics, and we are just going to sort of talk about the presuppositional apologetic method today. It is going to be a little different because I think the group has more in mind the Van Tillian style of apologetics, not the Clarkian one, which is the one that I hold to. So it should be pretty interesting. But I'd like Ben first to kind of tell me a little bit about himself and about his worldview and some of the problems he sees with the presuppositional apologetic.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm pretty familiar with the classic sort of, well, I guess you could call it the diversion. Been, talking with people who take that approach for a couple of years now, and it seems to me that the so-called argument, I don't really call it an argument, but they call it the presuppositional argument, starts off with the conclusion and just works backwards to sort of make up justifications for, or rationalizations, I should say, for why they think it would be true. It doesn't actually prove anything or try to prove anything, so it's not really an apologetic in the traditional sense of being a defense of the faith. It's really more of it seems like a verbal series of tricks to try to confuse and befuddle any kind of non-religious people or anyone who doesn't agree with the position of the presup person who's espousing that. So that's it. I mean, I don't think it's an honest position. I don't think that some of the things that they say, I don't think they actually believe. I don't really think they believe that there aren't any atheists, for example. They say it, but I don't think they actually believe it. So, there's a lot wrong with it, but that's enough to start with, I think.
Okay. So basically, in summary, your issues with the apologetic method is, circular reasoning and semantic abuse. That's the two major issues I heard that you brought up.
I guess that's probably the main thrust of what I said. Yeah.
Okay. Can you tell me about sort of your worldview? Like, do you come to this from an objectivist standpoint? I know a lot of the people over there are objectivists, or do you more or less come from a pragmatic standpoint?
I suppose if we were going to start latching on to labels, I prefer to go as label-free as possible for the sake of the audience, if nothing else, because many people haven't studied this. I think probably 90% of the people watching this haven't studied this as much as you have. Probably safe to say, don't you think? So,
okay, well, that may be true, but just kind of give a general.
Yeah. I think that pragmatism would be more along the lines of where I'm coming from. In other words, we are forced to use our reasoning, for example, because it works, and because we have nothing else. We have nothing else to use. We wake up in the morning and we're given tasks. Life puts things before us. What am I going to do with each moment? Am I going to wake up and take a shower and brush my teeth and put on my clothes and go to work or go to school? Or am I going to, sit around and ponder existential dilemmas about, how to know knowledge or truth? So pragmatism in the sense of we've got to get on with our lives, right? And so in that sense, sure, I would endorse a pragmatic view.
Sure. Give me just a second, Ben. I'm going to send the link. Some people are asking for the link to watch the Hangout, so I'm just going to send it out real quick if that's all right.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I'm really kind of new to this whole starting a Hangout thing. I really, to be honest, I hardly have a clue of what I'm doing. So.
No, I hear you. I have never hosted one. I attend them. I do the Hangouts. I've made a few videos, but I want to try to figure out the system, but I haven't really taken the time to figure out the whole Google Plus thing.
Doesn't appear to be that hard, but it doesn't stop me from messing up. So.
Yeah, you got to learn by failing sometimes, right?
Right.
And sometimes the internet errors, sometimes there's Google Plus problems that'll, on top of people have internet problems, and then Google Plus messes up, so it can be tricky.
I understand. All right, I just sent it out. Where's the right screen? Okay, there we go. Okay, so about pragmatism, are you aware of the origins of pragmatism and what it entails? I know some people sort of adopt a more moderate view of it, as in, we just want to use what works. But I mean, there are some philosophical nuances behind it, such as pragmatists typically don't really care as much about what's rational or what is reality. So you said that you want to avoid labels, so I assume that your position might vary a little bit on that. I'm sure, as someone who is so heavily against the presuppositional apologetic, that you would probably at least care about what reality actually is, correct?
Oh, sure. I mean, as far as the labels go, I mean, I can read a philosopher who might have endorsed pragmatism without calling myself a pragmatist. I mean,
Right.
I appreciate what some of the existentialists had to say, for example, but that doesn't make me an existentialist. I'm not even a philosopher. I mean, I enjoy philosophy. I've taken a few philosophy courses in college, but not enough to call myself any kind of expert. Like, but yeah, go on, Jason. Sorry.
That's okay, no worries. I just want to represent you accurately, and I know what you're saying, because I read philosophers, and I do the same thing. I eat the meat and I spit out the bones.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done that with Ben Till, and I've done that with Gordon Clark, and
Right.
William
And
Lane Craig, and others.
and you're free to do that. You're free to read as many philosophers, and philosophers throughout time have made lots of good points, and they've all disagreed with each other. And so you can look, and you're gonna agree with some, you're gonna disagree with others, and you're perfectly at liberty to do that. So.
Right, and I agree. So about the nature of truth, I guess let's start off by talking about that. Do you think that truth is discernible by what works, or do you think there might be more to it than that?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by discernible by what works.
Oh, sure. Well, basically, you said that you basically, we use our reasoning, we use our senses because that's what we have and it works. That's the position you gave. So just based off of that, I'm just wondering if you think that the usefulness or maybe the pragmatic value of a proposition gives credence to whether or not that proposition is true.
The words you're using are a little.
I'm sorry. Basically,
no, it's fine. I'll do my best. Look,
Okay.
I think that, like I said, we wake up every morning and we do what we have to do to get through the day. I mean, I understand that I need food to fuel my body. I understand that I need water and I need rest and I need certain other things. And so, I wake up and I make my eggs and toast or whatever I want to have for breakfast. And it's true, or at least it's true as far as I can tell, that eggs and toast are food and that they give me energy. I'm hungry before I eat them, and then I'm not hungry afterward. And then I can go throughout my day and until I get hungry again and I have to eat again. And I turn the key to my car and the engine comes on, and then I turn the wheel one direction and the car goes that direction. I turn it the other direction, it goes that direction. We have to learn from our experiences how things work. And so, I mean, the definition of truth can get tricky depending on which definition you want to use. But so far as I can tell, I know how to eat food. I know how to drive a car. I know how to do these certain things that I have to do to get through my life. And so, as far as I can tell, those things are true. It's true that eggs and toast are food, and that I know how to drive a car, just for example. And so, I guess you'd call that, if you want to link it back to pragmatism, you'd call that sort of pragmatic truth. But feel free to correct me wherever you disagree.
Well, it does seem to me that you do the way you do discern truth. It sounds to me like it's basically on what's useful, and of course that's because in your view that's all you have, that's all you can use, and that's why you approach your life that way. Now, as far as the nature of knowledge is concerned, everyone in their worldview starts with something called a first principle. It's like an axiom. I'm sure you heard the term before. In your worldview, whenever you're trying to, if someone was to ask you, how can you know anything at all, what would you start with?
How would you define a first principle?
It would just be basically the belief that comes first before any other beliefs.
Does it have to be defended?
Well, it does need to be defensible. It needs to be coherent. Obviously, a first principle is not ultimately something that's considered to be provable or demonstratable. It's just really a starting point. So like if you were to say, for instance, well, I start with my reasoning. Well, I could not then accuse you of circular reasoning because that's your first principle. That's just where you start at. So if I wanted to try and critique that, I'd have to take a different approach because, an axiom or a first principle is not an argument. It's just a belief that's held at the beginning of a worldview. Does that make sense?
Sure. So could my first principle be something like the natural world exists and it is all that exists?
You can really, I mean, you can really pick any first principle you like. You just have to, you know, make sure that it's coherent.
I don't actually think I have a first principle. I'm not in the philosophy that I've studied. That was never something that came up. So I'll just go with that, just to see where it leads. But
Okay.
we'll go with that. I'll just affirm that the natural world is real, and that so far as I can tell, supernaturalism is incoherent. So I'll just affirm a sort of naturalist perspective. How about that?
Okay, that's fine. Considering, you know, and this is not the position you're taking, but you know, in the context of our discussion, but you're saying, you said that you're not sure you have a first principle. Well, everyone has one. If you don't have a first principle, you can't even get off the ground in your epistemology, your view of knowledge.
Can I ask you something about that? Because when did you learn about the idea of a first principle?
When did I learn about it?
Yeah.
When I started studying, just basically when I started learning philosophy.
How long?
I started studying in seminary last year. Is whenever I really saw the term first principle.
So a year ago you learned about a first principle, and you're like in your early 20s, I think. So I mean,
like you know, terminologies.
So you went for most of your life never having heard of a first principle. You probably not. If someone would have asked you what your first principle was, you would have had no idea what they meant, and yet you've gone through your whole life figuring things out, going through, like I said, eating and feeding yourself and clothing yourself and having relationships with people and doing jobs and going to school and having knowledge and truth and all that other stuff without knowing anything about a first principle or what your first principle might be. And yet you're saying that you can't get off the ground unless you have a first principle. It seems a little bit like philosophical nonsense when you've basically proven just by the way that you've been living your life that you don't actually need that. And if you ask most people what their first principle is, they're not going to know what you're talking about, and yet they're perfectly functionally living their lives and doing just fine without it.
Okay, and I see your point, but when I'm talking about the first principle, I'm really talking about the term. If you asked me what I started with, what my first belief was, then I would you know, I would be able to tell you what my first belief was. All I'm doing is just explaining the term. We got to call it something.
Well, do you mean first temporally or first metaphysically?
Well, I mean, we're talking in the context of epistemology. So
Okay.
we're talking in the context of knowledge. I mean, you could try and start with a metaphysical principle, but you wouldn't really be able to deduce any sort of view on knowledge from just a metaphysical claim. It's kind of backwards. Whenever you make a metaphysical claim, you're actually even going outside the context of epistemology.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I mean, let's say you're talking to someone and you ask them about their first principle and they don't know what that means or how do they know? I mean, so if they don't know what their own first principle is, and they're trying to discover what their first principle is, don't they then have to use whatever it is they have learned, whether they be 20 years old, 40 years old, 60 years old, they have to use whatever they've learned to then discern what their first principle is. But then they're using principles they already hold to then discern what you're now calling a first principle. So it's not temporally prior. It doesn't come first in time. You're calling it sort of metaphysically prior, at least that's what I gather you're saying, but it's not actually necessary for getting off the ground. You use the phrase getting off the ground because a first principle has to be derived from other things, other knowledge that a person already has. So I'm just, okay, sorry, that was a long-winded way of asking.
It's okay. I mean, I know where you're trying to get at. But
if somebody doesn't know what their first principle is, then how do they discover it? How do they figure it out?
Well, they have to have a first principle. They may not be willing to admit it. You know, but they do have a first principle, you know, and even if you don't know what a first principle is, you do have a first principle. I mean, you have to start somewhere, and if you are interacting with the world, you start somewhere, and you're starting somewhere, and if someone says that, well, I don't know what my first principle is, or I don't, but I'm just going to do everything, I'm just going to go ahead and live my life anyway, I don't really care, it's a bunch of nonsense, that's a philosophy known as irrationalism. It's a form of skepticism where they say, well, it's a bunch of hooey, I'm just going to live my life. And if someone wants to do that, that's fine, but it's not rational. So when I ask what a first principle is, we're in a discussion, I guess, / debate. So we're talking in the context of rationality. So while someone may be able to live their life, and someone may be able to go through the motions, and they're not, I mean, if they can't tell you what, can't lay out their epistemology to you, that means they just really, they just really haven't thought about it in a rational way. And I would assume that in the context of our discussion, both of us would want to appear to be rational. And if someone's going to say, well, I don't really care about first principles, it's nonsense, and I don't really know what it is, but I don't really care either. It works, that is an irrationalist position. And I think that would be ironic for someone who's trying to, speak out against presuppositional apologetics as irrational. I think that would be kind of a strange position for someone that has that goal to take.
Yeah, it might be. I'm wondering, because I think that being in a position to study philosophy is somewhat of a privileged position just to begin with. Most people in their lives will never take even one philosophy course. Most people in the church, I mean, if you were to set up a booth outside your church and just take a poll and ask your parishioners of your local church if they've ever studied philosophy at all, and most people will say no. I mean, I'll guarantee it, probably over 90%. So I mean,
most Christians don't even read their Bible.
Oh, I'm not picking on Christians. I think most people in general. I'm just saying, but use people sit outside of a church or a supermarket and just, I don't know, give people 50 cents or $1 to take your poll or whatever if you're really interested. But so when you talk about these kinds of things, like everybody has a first principle. I mean, I don't think most people, if you asked them, would know what you meant, or even if you explained it, would know how to tell you. So that's why I was trying to figure out, when you're saying that, I don't want you to just be talking over everyone's heads. I mean, I think we need to have a really clear understanding of what it is you mean, right?
Sure.
Okay. So I don't know, like I said, I don't know if I have that first principle thing, but I'm just for the sake of the discussion, I'm just saying, well, I'll just affirm that the universe is real, and that so far as I can tell, supernatural entities and forces are not. I'll just take a sort of naturalist stance for the sake of our discussion.
Okay, so that's basically metaphysical naturalism is what you're positing, is what you start with.
For the sake of our discussion, it's the best thing I could think of, because I really.
You can say that. I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with you taking that position.
Yeah.
But now, the very goal of a first principle and what it has to do in order to build a coherent epistemology, or really a coherent, foundation or view of knowledge, so to speak, would have to answer the question of how do you know, and that's what a first principle has to do. So if someone were to ask you, with your first principle of naturalism, how do you know anything at all, what would you say?
I would have to rely on, and you get just so you know, I'm not. I'll answer your question, but I'd also like to hear your first principle also, because we haven't heard that yet.
Yeah,
but,
we can certainly talk about it.
But I'd have to describe an evolutionary description of our origins. I'd have to talk about how evolution creates beings of increasing in complexity over time, or at least it has in our case on our little planet Earth, to the point where we have brains that are now capable of understanding the universe in some small part. So I mean, there's an evolutionary part of the naturalistic view of the world is evolution, essentially, that we evolved from so-called lower life forms, even though I don't really like that phrase, lower life forms. Everybody knows what it means. So our brains were fashioned by evolution. The reason that brains that work were preserved over brains that didn't work, or brains that worked less well, is that they aided in survival. So I guess that comes back to pragmatism. If you have a brain that effectively is telling you where the predator is versus not effectively telling you where the predator is, or a brain that knows where the watering hole is versus a brain that just forgets everything. So the brains as a sort of processing center for information, the more effective brains were preserved and enhanced by evolution, eventually leading to the beautiful, wonderful brains we have today. That's a very, very crude, way of talking about evolution, but it gives you some idea.
Okay, so you would appeal to evolution in order to basically justify how you obtain knowledge, correct? That would be your answer to the problem of skepticism. I
would describe the evolutionary answer for why we have brains that can think and talk about things like philosophy and first principles. Yeah. Okay.
So I'm just curious. Do you hold evolution to be a logical position?
As much as that sounds like a trappy question, I'll go ahead and say, yeah, it's logical.
Okay, it kind of is a trappy question. So, just so but you would hold that position
Sure, of course.
Okay.
As long as you don't conflate evolution with the Big Bang, as long as you don't conflate the evolution with abiogenesis, we are just talking about biological evolution, not all that other stuff that gets.
I'll let you define your own terms. That's fine.
Yeah.
But are you aware that science is always false? Have you ever heard that statement before?
Science. I mean, we can Google a definition, but science is not a proposition that can be true or false. Science is a process that leads to results that can be true or false. Science itself, or the scientific method, maybe I should say, can't be false. It's a process. A process isn't false. There's no such thing as a false process. A process is just a process. So it can lead to true or false results. I don't think you'd argue with that. I think you probably would affirm some of the things that the scientific method has taught us. I mean, we're speaking on computers, that use satellites that are, jetting laser shit all over. Sorry, I shouldn't cuss on your thing, but the technology is quite amazing, and it was brought to us by science. So we have good reason to believe that science works.
Okay, so science works. It's pragmatic, and that's and I agree. Science is very useful. I completely agree with that. But there's a couple of reasons why I say that it's always false. First off, science is not truth, and you affirm that. But if science is not truth, if the hypothesis and science are not true, if they cannot be true by definition, then it seems that according to logic, the law of contradiction, for instance, something can either be a proposition like a hypothesis, which is a proposition, cannot be neither true or false. It has to be one or the other. And if science by nature cannot be true, then it has to be false, unless you were to reject logic.
Yeah, let me just make a correction here. This is a bit of a category error. I tried to describe it before you went on to make that category error, but I'll go ahead and read. I just typed science definition. I'm not cherry-picking my definitions. I just typed the word science definition into Google, and I'll just go ahead and read it. The intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. So let me just a shorter version of that. It's an activity. Science is the intellectual and practical activity. And activity cannot be true or false. Just like running or jumping or swimming or thinking can't be true or false, it's not a proposition with truth value. I hope you know what I mean by truth value. But activities don't have truth value. Science can give us propositions with truth value, such as the Earth is roughly spherical. But science itself is not a proposition that can be true or false. It's an activity.
Okay. You're saying that you get knowledge from science, and this is because I think you made a mistake there. What I'm talking about is the hypotheses that are developed in science. The hypotheses that are developed in science are propositions. Propositions by definition can be rejected or accepted. Hypotheses are propositions. Now, science as a process, science as a process itself, the definition of science. I guess if you want to argue that the definition of science, or rather just the whole nature of it's not a proposition, okay, well that's fine. But what I'm talking about are the hypotheses, because what you're doing is you're trying to deduce propositions from your naturalistic starting point, your first principle, in order to try and explain how you know things. But there are two major problems. First off, the first problem is that any hypothesis, because of the nature of science, which hypotheses have to be propositions because they can be accepted or rejected. That's the definition of a proposition. Has to be either true or false. The second problem is that all experiments that are used to attempt to validate a hypothesis or a theory, such as evolution, commits the logical fallacy of asserting the consequent.
Affirming the consequent.
It's also called asserting the consequent too. There's two different ways you can call it. I just say asserting because I just think it sounds better. But asserting the consequent would be the fallacy that science commits. So if you're going to try and say that you can derive some justified true belief from a standpoint of a philosophy that commits that fallacy in order to accept or reject a proposition, then it seems to me that the first principle you're using doesn't really lead you to any sort of what you could call capital T truth. absolute truth. You get what I'm saying?
Sorry, yeah. I think I do. I think I do. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, the position you're taking and the way you're going to try and the way you're approaching your epistemology is one that isn't in coherence with logic. So that's really my point. So really, from your first principle, when a skeptic asks you how can you know anything at all, when they say know anything, they say knowing it with proper justification. I mean, if you use a process that's fallacious in order to try and justify knowledge, the skeptic's going to call you out on it.
Can you describe why it is that you think that the scientific? But by the way, you did change your terms there, so I mean, just so everybody's clear, anybody who's watching this, is that at first you said science is false, and then you went on to say scientific hypotheses are false. So those are different statements, and that's why I made the clarification. Because science is a process, and science is made up of thousands of hypotheses. I mean, you could create a hypothesis right now that could be true or false. But the process itself isn't true or false. That's the point I was making. And so could you just describe what you mean by you think that science as a process or the scientific method might be a more useful way to talk about that, is guilty of affirming?
So, I mean, maybe the statement's too general. I've had a few people, I actually gave a lecture in a church, and someone said, isn't that a little bit of a general statement? And I know what I mean, but I guess when people hear me say that, they don't know what I mean. So then they like you, they raise questions. So I guess I'll definitely be more careful about saying that in the future, and making sure that when I do, I explain what I mean.
Cool, that's awesome. So you said that science is guilty, or the scientific method, I guess, is guilty of affirming or asserting the consequence. So how do you mean that? What does that mean?
Well, when I say that, I'm focusing on the way, hypotheses are confirmed or denied in science. I think my dog has something. I'll be right back. I'm gonna get her before she eats something she shouldn't.
Should I sing everyone a song while you're gone? Talk about something totally inappropriate? Nah.
Sorry about that. She got a hold of a water bottle. I had no idea how she did that.
I just gave your audience the meaning of life while you were away, so you missed it.
Oh, you did? Oh, sorry. I missed it.
Yeah.
I'll watch. I'll go back and watch it.
Yeah, it was good stuff, man. Gold.
Yeah, I appreciate you talking while I was away. You were asking me about how science commits to asserting the consequent. What I mainly am focusing on in that instance is the way hypotheses are confirmed in science. If your hypothesis is correct, you should observe a certain phenomenon. If P implies Q, that's the first premise. Then the second premise is the phenomenon that I predicted happens. That's Q, right? So then you say, therefore, the hypothesis is confirmed. That's P, and that's the logical structure of asserting the consequent.
Okay, I think I get what you're saying, because science doesn't take into account affirming the consequent or asserting the consequent is it's a fallacy because it ignores other possible sources of causation. That's correct, right?
Yeah,
so I mean, if P therefore Q, Q therefore P, is a logically fallacious statement. So you're saying that so scientists make predictions that if this hypothesis is true, then we would expect some result. We get the result that we want. Therefore, we were right, I guess, right?
That's correct.
So do you think there's any way for science to control against potential sources of errors? I mean, what do you think of using control groups or in a lab setting, controlling for all the possible variables? I mean, if you're working with a petri dish and you change only one variable and you say change an enzyme from one enzyme to a different enzyme, if you get a different reaction with a different enzyme, then is it reasonable then to think that to look at what happened that was different when you change only one variable and say that the enzyme did something different? I mean, this is how we, for example, I've been using this example a lot lately, so I'm gonna wear this one out. But pharmaceutical companies, they test drugs and they test the effectiveness of drugs based on tests more or less like this, right? I mean, you test them against a control group. This is how we have all the medicines we have now. I mean, this is how we have aspirin and antibiotics and every other thing. So I mean, does it make sense to you that what do you think of the idea of using control groups that'll tell you whether or not there's other factors involved? Because other than asserting some sort of magical force, if you're in a lab and you've controlled for everything and you get a result, then what else could it be other than, you know, saying that an angel dipped its wing in the petri dish or something?
That's a great question, actually. And what I would say is that I'm not, you know, control groups are fine. Like I said, I don't reject science. I view it as useful. I just don't hold that science can lead to any justified knowledge that would be required to escape the problem of skepticism. But yeah, using control groups and you know and trying to do experiments to produce useful results, I am all for that. No problem. You know, I don't have any issue with that. But you did ask a good question. You know, well, I mean, wouldn't it be reasonable to conclude that there was some sort of maybe I guess you were trying to get to a natural cause instead of maybe a supernatural one. Is that what you were trying to get at, or were you just talking about any cause whatsoever?
Well, you know, the boy, let's, you know, what would you say? I'm trying to think of a good example.
I have a couple ideas.
Let me give you one example. Okay, so let's say like if I punch someone in the nose hard enough, I can break their nose. So, you know, if you see someone with a broken nose, you can assume that someone punched them in the nose hard enough to break their nose. That would be like a form of affirming or asserting the consequent, because you know a cause that's capable of breaking a nose, but you don't actually know if there was some other cause that broke a nose. But
right.
And that's out in the real world, and that makes sense. But when you are in a lab setting where you have controlled for everything other than one, you just change one variable. There doesn't. I mean, like Jason, we talked a little bit before we went live, and you said, you know, your version of the presup is different than most, and so like I haven't taken any time to look up, you know, why you think that the scientific method is fallacious. I'm sure there's a good explanation for why it's not. I'm not convinced that it is, and it's shown itself to work time and time again. I mean, we have space stations and satellites and computers and every other kind of thing that, you know, science works. I mean, so whether you want to call it fallacious or not, it works. It's demonstrated itself to work time and time again, and it works. I mean, if you can suggest something that works better, it would be one thing if you had science over here producing like jack squat, and then like a team of prayer groups over here just praying for knowledge and just getting revelation that gives some kind of tangible results, like computers 10 times better than your Mac or your PC, or, you know, space stations that can fly to Jupiter and back in 5 seconds. That'd be amazing, right? But as it is, all we have is science. I mean, there really isn't anything else. As far as our pursuit of knowledge, what else? We really don't have anything better than the scientific method. There's not even a close second.
Okay, let's talk about that. I guess I wanted to get to your question, but you just went in another interesting direction. And what you said is, well, you know, it works and it's done so many good things. You know, why should I, you know, so basically I guess what you're saying is, why should I care if it's fallacious or not, because we get all these wonderful results. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think that the experiments might not ever be perfect to the point where you could absolutely eliminate the possibility that there's some unknown cause. And I don't think that science isn't, for one thing, science isn't working in the realm of absolutes. And maybe that's where you're going. Maybe that's where you're going wrong, because I've, like I said, I haven't taken any time to look up what other smart people have had to say about your particular claim here about the science affirming the consequent. I just, I don't think that for it to be absolute, for a scientist to say absolutely that something is true, then you might be right. But they're not saying absolutely. They're saying that what's sometimes called the inference to the best explanation. The scientists make an inference to the best explanation based on the available data, and the available data is changing all the time. That's why we have different answers today than we will have 10 years from now, different answers today than we had 10 years ago, because the available data changes and the inference changes based on that data. So if you're looking for absolute truth, you're right, you're going to need religion. But if you're looking for a progression toward a truth that we may never completely understand, then you're going to need science. And it might not be perfect. I'll admit it's not perfect, but it's by far the best thing we have. And so, I mean, calling it fallacious, I think, is a stretch, and I'll need to do more research to actually conclude for sure, or at least to my level of certainty, not that I want to go off on the certainty tangent, but to conclude for myself that it's actually fallacious, I'll need to look into it more. But
let me help you out with that. If you want to try and look up look up operationalism.
Okay.
Yeah, just look that up, and that will get you going. Because you'll see that you'll be able to see like the pro-operationalist arguments and then the cons, of course. There are obviously people that disagree with operationalism. But people like the British philosopher Karl Popper, for instance, Bertrand Russell, the atheistic philosopher, Albert Einstein too was an operationalist. So there are some notable intellectuals that are operationalist. That take more of a pragmatic view of science. Some Christians that have are people like Gordon Clark, John Robbins. So you'll see people on both sides that are on it, but you also see people too that speak out against operationalism in defense of science, being a rationally valid process, like a logically valid process. So you can look that up. I don't really, if you're not comfortable in that area to where you say, well, I don't really know, I haven't really heard of this before, so but I'm gonna look into it. That's fine.
Let me try to explain just a little bit about what I'm talking about. I could even go as far as to just provisionally just agree with you in some sense that maybe you're onto something. Okay, maybe there's some fallacy at the heart of science. I'm not saying that's actually true, but for the sake of discussion, I could just say that it's true. This reminds me a little bit of the problem of induction, Hume's problem of induction. The idea that we can't say that the future will be like the past. The future was like the past in the past, but to say that the future will be like the past because it was like the future was like the past in the past is to beg the question. It's a famous problem in philosophy, and so. But I think that if we could resurrect Hume and bring him back to talk to us right now, and if we were to ask him, hey Dave, should we use induction or should we not use induction? And he would say, absolutely, you should use induction. You should. Of course, you're going to use induction. You don't have any other choice. You've learned so much of what you've learned in your life. Like I talked about driving a car. I've inferred through my experience. I've made the inductive inference. I've induced, or I mean, that's probably the wrong way to say it. I have the induction now that I know how to drive a car. It's worked so many times. It may not work tomorrow, but through my experience, I've learned through induction that I know how to, drive a car is just an example. I know how to play certain games. I know how to function on a computer. I'm proving that right now by talking to you. So I mean, and Hume would say the same thing. If you were to ask Hume, induction is fallacious, so should we use it? He would say, yes, you should use it. He would say probably that he uses it every day and that there's no choice but to use it. To not use it would mean that you really wouldn't have any tool for learning about the world, because you pretty much have to use induction to continue learning about the world. So while there may be some philosophical problem with science, which I'm not sure if there is, because like I said, I haven't done enough research, I would still be willing to stick my neck out and say science is still solid as far as I'm concerned.
I'd say solid in the sense that it's useful. I wouldn't say that it's rational, or that it's true or anything like that. But I think you've already agreed with me that that's not the purpose of science.
Sure. We may have
let's talk about.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but let's go because you went to induction. Like I said, I don't want to. It's something you haven't done research on. I don't want to put you there. I wouldn't want someone to do it to me. So, but let's talk about induction. You said that if we brought David Hume back, he would say, well, yeah, we should use induction. Well, I agree with you. I think David Hume would say that because David Hume used it all the time. You can see in his works and everything, he used induction all the time. I'm sure he used induction all the time, throughout living his life. I do too. You do. We all use induction.
Right.
The problem is, I guess, is that, so you try and use induction to try and explain how we can know things. If we can't rationally justify induction, then it seems to me that we cannot use it to try and make it. We can't really use it to try and make arguments concerning what truth is.
I can rationally justify induction in the same way that I rationally justified the other statement you made about science being fallacious. Is that induction isn't absolute? Okay, so I might, if I only ever had cars that start when you turn the key, if I only ever owned cars that always started, you could forgive me for believing that every time you turn the key, the car will start. That would be a little bit naive for someone to believe that, because most of us know that batteries have problems occasionally. But once I had a problem with a battery or an alternator or something, now I've learned through induction that cars start most of the time, but sometimes they don't. So then as I as I have new experiences, like I said, as the facts come in, now I have to change my expectations. So, you know, every single day, like I said, the world shows me new things, and then I have to change my expectations for what today will be like, what tomorrow will be like. And, you know, it's like I said, it's not absolutely, it doesn't work absolutely. I don't expect to be able to form expectations using induction that will always be right. But in other words, okay, Jason, so what induction does is it helps us build expectations about the world, right? And we really have no choice but to build expectations. Our brain will do it subconsciously. You don't even have to make an effort to build expectations about the world. And so induction is the primary thing that is helping you to build your expectations for today, for tomorrow, for the rest of your life. And really, you don't have anything else. And so you can poke holes and you can say, well, induction doesn't work absolutely, and it may have this, you know, Hume said this and that and the other thing, and that's fine. But really, I mean, we have to go on using it. It does show itself to work. And I think just by saying that induction is an absolute, if you're looking for an absolute truth, you're not going to get it. But if you're working for a functional truth or for a provisionally true truth, then it works as well as any.
So there's no absolute truth? Is that what?
Well,
like
absolute meaning, people use that word in different ways. If you mean absolute meaning independent of other
immutable,
truths.
Unchangeable, eternal, that kind of thing.
There may be absolute truths. Our ability to know them is questionable, being that we're subjective. We're forced to view the world through our own subjective lens, and which is imperfect. Our cognitive abilities are imperfect. Our senses are imperfect. So there may be an objective truth that is difficult or impossible for us to understand. There are some things that seem very difficult to try to imagine how they would not be true. I mean, the laws of logic are the ones that come up most commonly. But, you know, yeah, absolutely. It's not an easy question. You know, sometimes
it isn't. I agree. It's not an easy question. You know, but I think I'm starting to see where some of the issues are that are surfacing, you know, in our disagreement. So I want to kind of cover those real quick. You're rationalizing, and this may be a little lengthy, just so you know, but I'm gonna definitely give you, you know, an opportunity to respond. First off, I'm gonna try and keep it short. But basically, though, you're trying to rationalize something based off of its usefulness. You know, you say, well, I can rationalize science since we have computers, we have television sets, we have cars. You know, we have all these things that science has given us. Well, that's fine. But that's not really. It's not really, you know, what we're talking about is whether or not a worldview is rational or not. And we can look at a plethora of previous models that we've had, such as caloric chemistry, for instance, such as Newtonian physics. You know, especially the assumption of absolute gravity and absolute time. You know, those turned out to be false, but yet in their days, whenever they were in practice, they worked beautifully. You know, it was useful. But we can see, though, that usefulness, and you may even agree with this, usefulness does not mean just because something's useful does not mean that it's actually true. And we can see this demonstrated over and over again throughout the history of science. And that's sort of the way science works, because science is more about falsification than trying to prove that something's absolutely true. But then you have induction, and you say, well, you know, we use it because it's all we have. Well, I mean, you can claim that, but that's not a position that is going to be considered, you know, rational. You know, because we know that what's useful doesn't mean that it's true. And what we're talking about here is epistemology. We're talking about justified true belief. But you said that there isn't any absolute truth, and if you want to believe that, that at least can be known. You know, you think it's doubtful. I could ask you, well, I mean,
I'm not sure if I did say that. I don't think I said there was no absolute truth. I said that there may very well be, but our ability to know such things is questionable.
Okay, thank you. That's what I'm trying to focus on. To say that our ability to know it is questionable, I mean, that would you consider that to be an absolute truth? Or would that be another truth that sort of you're not sure of?
I want to be careful with the language. Absolute, for the sake of what I'm talking about right now, absolute things are immutable, like you said, immutable. They are unchanging in time and space, and they're not dependent on other truths. So for me, to be making any kind of statement at all is dependent on my own existence. It's dependent on my own ability to form concepts and speak English and lots of things like that. So in that sense, anything that I say, I mean, I'm not God. I'm not claiming to be God or any kind of oracle of truth. I'm just a guy who doesn't really have anything figured out. I'm not pretending like I've got anything figured out. I'm doing my best to make my way through life and figure things out as I go along. And so I think it would be arrogant for me to assert that I have the absolute truth. I mean, I'm even if you think you're a pretty smart person, I think it's wise to have the humility to realize your own limitations. And I do my best to realize my own limitations. And part of that is not being overconfident in your ability to understand the fundamental truth of reality, because I mean, frankly, I don't think we have the tools. We can do our best, but that doesn't mean that we can actually get there.
Now, as someone who presupposes basically a naturalistic philosophy as their first principle, what do you think of logic?
I do want to say one other thing. I can answer that about logic. That's a little bit of an open-ended question. I'll try to do my best with it. But you said that just because something is useful doesn't mean that it's true.
That's correct.
I don't know if, I mean, once again, we're back to that question about whether something is true or not. I mean, when I talk about my ability to drive a car or to feed myself, I mean, it may not be, because it's useful, it may not be true, but it's true that it's useful. It's true to me that it's useful for me to be able to drive a car. It's useful for me to be able to know how to drive a car, and it's useful for me to be able to rely on my ability to continue to do that just to navigate our little world. So, I mean, calling it true in some kind of abstract sense, I'm not sure what that means, but these things have proven useful, that among many other things. So I'm not sure if that clarifies that. And you asked about.
That's fine. I mean, we're really, because I'm talking in the context of philosophy. That's what it's in sort of in epistemology, and I think you're sort of speaking in a different context from what I.
Oh, sure. But when you say that something is true or not true, make sure that the thing that you're talking about actually has a truth value. Because, like, when I'm using a process to go about my life and get from point A to point B, my processes are not true or false. My processes just are, and they work or they don't. So, I mean, that's a little bit of a confusion there. Maybe it's a problem on my end. I'm not sure.
Well, the problem is we're coming from this from two completely different perspectives. That's really what the problem is.
You did ask about logic, and your question was a little bit too open-ended. So could you ask me
to specify it some?
Sure. Yeah. You said what do I think of logic? But is there something you could ask that's a little more specific?
Yeah, I'll show you where I'm driving at. When I asked you that question, I was just talking about, like, do you think logic is useful? That's one question I would ask you, and then two, I guess another question I'd ask is from a naturalistic presupposition, like a naturalistic first principle. How do you justify being able to deduce the law of contradiction from a presupposition that says that the natural world is all there is and the supernatural doesn't exist?
I think you mean the law of non-contradiction, because I don't know of a...
Law of contradiction is another way to put it, ironically. You can call it the law of contradiction, or you can call it the law of non-contradiction.
Well, you're teaching me all kinds of things. I've never heard that one before. So
yeah, if you I hate saying this, but if you end up Googling it, then you'll see people call it the law of contradiction. I think it's one of the most ironic things in philosophy is that the law of contradiction can be called the law of non-contradiction and the law of contradiction.
It's like flammable and inflammable, right? It's
exactly.
one of our... Well, my philosophy professor in college called it the law of non-contradiction. So
most people do. It's just easier to not say the non.
So you said logic. Sorry, one more time. We've gone off on a couple of tangents.
It's okay. I'll just ask it again. So, basically, do you think that, first off, my first question is, do you think logic is useful? And two, how do you account for how do you deduce the law of contradiction from a naturalistic framework?
Yeah. Yes, of course, logic is useful if you could have one brain thinking logically and one other brain disregarding logic, then it's pretty clear that the brain thinking logically would be thinking better in a just sort of a generic sense. Okay. But you said, how would you? I think that the way that you'd figure out the law of contradiction or non-contradiction with a theistic worldview or an atheistic worldview would be the same. I think that the people who did figure out these laws may have been atheists or theists. I'm not sure who came up with them. It might have been Greek. It might go back to Plato. But
most people use Aristotle's.
Okay, so I mean, they were pagans,
Right.
but if they had been Christians, they could have also figured out these same basic principles, and they're figured out. The laws of logic are named that because they are just basic truths that have been deduced about the universe that just can't be any other way. That couldn't be any other way. The idea that something shares the law of identity now, but the idea that something is itself and it's not something other than itself. An idea that an object shares its own properties, that it has all the properties that it has and it doesn't have the properties that it doesn't have. These are just the most basic logical principles you could come up with, and I don't know how positing a god or no god would help you. I think that it happened to have been pagans who came up with these principles, but it could have been Christians, it could have been anyone. They're just logically deduced from observations of the universe.
Ben, how much longer do you have? Then I know you said that you had a headache earlier, and
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm feeling okay. Well, I think we're getting close to an hour. Why don't we wrap it up in 20 or 30 minutes?
Okay, that's fine. Because I want to be fair to you and talk about my worldview as well.
Good, please.
So we won't. But I just have a couple more questions to ask you before we go on to mine. All right. So you said basically the first thing you said was that the laws of logic were discovered by pagans. And then you question what benefit would there be to posit Christianity in order to or basically how would a Christian explain the fact that a non-Christian is the one who basically took note of the laws of logic. You did insinuate that question, right?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think I just said that they happen to have been pagans, but they could have believed in God or not, and I'm not sure if it would have changed the formulation of the laws of logic. I don't think
it wouldn't have. According to the Christian worldview, it wouldn't have. But we'll come back to that. You can ask me about that if you want to whenever we talk about my worldview. We'll just skirt over that for now. But you also said you referred to the law of identity. And you referred to the law of contradiction. Do you think those laws are universally true? Like, as by true, of course, I mean immutable, unchangeable, always true. Anytime I say truth, that's the definition I'm using, unless I say otherwise.
Yeah. Some people bring up quantum theory here, and I don't feel like I'm qualified to really talk about that. Some people.
I heard it before, but if you want to explain it, you can.
No. I don't. I mean, I've studied it only just very superficially, and I don't have any confidence in my ability to try to use quantum theory to win an argument. I'm not even really, Jason, trying to necessarily win an argument. I'm just trying to tell you.
Well, I'm not really either. I said debate, but this is really more of a discussion.
It's more of a discussion, and I prefer it that way. And you're very civil.
I don't like doing
civil.
Drag down.
I also want to say, Jason, you're very civil and pleasant, and I appreciate that. It's a change of tone from the way that many other people conduct themselves online, so thank you for that.
Most people think I mean because, when I write, I guess I come off as really harsh sometimes, but I don't really mean it that way, but, just in writing, it's really difficult to not be offensive.
I think I describe you as slightly cocky. You don't really, I don't think you come off as mean. I think you just are a little bit cocky sometimes. That's
I would probably agree with that. That's something I have to work on.
So I think I might have interrupted. You were talking about go on about love.
Oh, I can barely even remember what I'm talking about. Yeah, I just as far as where was I going? Do you remember the last thing I said?
You asked me if something about
if they're universal.
No. Oh, you said you did ask me a question. You asked me if the laws are universal. For one thing, I do want to describe the difference. The laws. Human, like man-made laws, when people hear this word law, we happen to use the same word in two different ways, or maybe more than two different ways. But man-made laws are not like nature's laws. When we talk about the laws of logic, or the laws of gravity, or laws of any other law, it's not the same as a man-made law. I mean, like a law, like a man-made law, can be broken at will. I mean, I can go right now and go 26 miles an hour in the 25, and I'm breaking the law. Nature's laws are based on observed regularities. So we have observed that the universe is a certain way, and we infer it's inferred. So you can talk about how that the inference is not valid based on Hume, but based on inference, we're going to say that at sea level an object will fall at 9.8 meters per second squared, and it's going to continue doing so until we have some reason to think that the law of gravity has changed. And I think that physicists actually have good reason to think that the universe won't change, because they view space-time in a more nuanced, more sophisticated way than you and I do. they wouldn't really think of the past, present, and future in those same terms as a philosopher might. But that's a different discussion. So, and we probably need to get some physicists in here to actually have that, make it worthwhile.
Yeah, there's actually, you hear philosophers arguing with physicists over the nature of time all the time.
All the time, ironically. Time is a confusing thing. It took me until I was probably in my mid-20s to realize that I don't really understand time. Like, it's a strange concept.
It's really strange. It still, it does boggle my mind when I try and think about it. Even when I think of,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Even when I think about the fact that I'm here, it boggles my mind. It just, it's really, when you think about it, it's kind of crazy.
It is crazy. Think about everything that could have happened that could have prevented your existence, or think about all the people that have come and gone who are now dead. I mean, like, how is it that we are here now and we're living when so many other people either will never be born or are already dead, and here we are, living, breathing, speaking. It's really something.
Right. I guess I just want to ask you one last question before we move on to the Christian worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the law of contradiction is sufficient to show that maybe a proposition or even a view of the world as a whole is false?
Is it sufficient? Probably necessary, but not sufficient. I'm not sure how you could just use the law of non-contradiction to prove something false, unless it was just directly violating itself by, if you just said an apple is not an apple, then that proposition would be false. But
it would be tautology. It wouldn't mean anything.
It would be tautologically false, right? If you said a thing is not itself, that would be a violation. That would be a proposition that's untrue based on the law of non-contradiction. But if you said something like Jesus rose from the dead, I can't use the law of non-contradiction to prove one way or another whether that's true or not.
Let me explain to you what I mean, because I keep, because like I said, I told you before we got on here that the approach I use is different. So what I mean is like, when I look at worldviews, what I do is I try and use the law of contradiction to show inconsistencies in opposing worldviews to mine. I use the law of contradiction to show that that there are certain inconsistencies in the worldview. That shows that it's and that would show that it's false because there's self-contradictions in it. And one thing I would say, for instance, just to summarize what I think of what you presented in this talk, you start with the first principle of naturalism, basically, and then you use science to try and find out more about the universe, for useful purposes and everything, but it doesn't really answer the question of how do we know anything at all, as in how do we know the truth, the capital T truth, absolute truth. But it seems to me your answer is that, well, you really, as far as you being able to know it, you're skeptical of the fact, of the idea that you're able to know that truth, which to me would seem to insinuate that it would have to be true in an absolute sense, or else that you couldn't know. That you wouldn't be able to know absolute truth in order for you to even deny that you know absolute truth. So that's one of the criticisms I would raise. I would also raise it against people who use induction to try and get knowledge, because if the induction is ultimately not justifiable, then it's not logical to say that induction leads to knowledge if it's not justifiable on a basis, a rationalistic basis. And then we talked about pragmatism and how pragmatism is a enterprise that is deemed useful, but we have already seen through superseded scientific theories that pragmatism is that basically just because something is useful doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So those are the kind and not just not to pick on your thing, but that's just the way I would use the law of contradiction to try and expose inconsistencies in worldviews. You can respond to what I say if you want, or if not, we can move on to Christianity. Whichever way you want to go is fine.
Well, that was a lot. You said at least, I think, 3 things that could each take me 5 or 10 minutes to try to unpack and
I understand that
and describe. I think you have gotten a little bit tricky with the language. I think that's. I think you've got some clever sort of the ways that you formulated these things are clever. I think that if I took the time, I could pull out mistakes along the way for each of those things that you've said.
If you want to meditate on them and then have another discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be fine. I mean, I'd need to actually go back and replay what you said because there's a lot there. But I mean, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with what I've said. I think it's all been pretty reasonable. I think your objections, I pretty much understand where you're coming from, and maybe we can, like you said, do this again and talk more. So yeah, we can go on to the Christianity thing.
Okay, that's fine. This is probably what you've been waiting for, I assume.
Well, no, it's been fun. The whole thing's been.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. How much more time do you have, by the way?
Oh, let's give it another. Like I said, give it another 15 minutes or so. Okay,
that's fine. Yeah, because I just don't. I want to try and keep it an hour. If no one watches 4-hour hangouts. At least that I.
No, I think we're gonna be. I think we're gonna be around an hour and a half, and that's a decent time.
Okay, that's fine. All right. So as far as my worldview is concerned, I start with what's called the axiom of revelation. And the axiom of revelation basically just says it's very simple. It says the Bible alone is the Word of God. That is my starting point. When it comes to epistemology, I say that Scripture is foundational for being able to rationally be able to justify knowing things. For instance, for the uniformity of nature, I would appeal to something such as Genesis chapter 8 verse 22. That basically says that God causes the sun to rise and to set. I would appeal to other texts such as Jeremiah chapter 31 verses 35 to 37 to show that basically nature does operate in a uniform fashion. So based off of that, I would use induction. Because I know that nature is going to probably behave the same way that it has in the past. And I would not say that induction leads to knowledge, capital K knowledge or capital T truth that says that it leads you to absolute conclusions. I would just say that it's basically anything that's derived off of induction is nothing more than really an opinion. I would say the same thing about science, because science is based off of induction and asserting the consequent. Since I have such a commitment to being logical, and the problem of asserting the consequent and the problem of induction, being able to lead to justified true belief, I would say that science too is a useful enterprise. We can see that we can look at, for instance, we can look at a television set and try and apply principles that we have come up with in science to the television set to get the desired effect. But there are times though where we see effects and we're not really sure we can't really prove what actually caused the effects to happen, but we know because of the uniformity of nature that Scripture teaches that we can be justified in using the process again and again to get the results that we desire. So in the process, in the sense of induction and the sense of science, that would be my view. And I guess I'll stop there so that you have time to say what you wish about what I had stated, and then maybe we can move on to other things if you want to.
Sure. Well, for one thing, you used the word axiom, and I guess we're saying that axioms and first principles are more or less the same. It's what it sounds like you're saying.
It depends. Let me clarify that. I apologize. I don't know why, but sometimes I just when I say first principle and axiom, I've had Christians ask me why I throw them back and forth. The first principle is the axiom of revelation, and the first principle is an axiom. It's just like the axiom that comes first before everything else.
Okay. The thing with axioms, at least scientifically speaking, is that they are supposed to be as minimal as possible. They're supposed to be just the simplest thing you could possibly use, as you said, to get off the ground. And the problem I'm having with your axiom, this so-called axiom of revelation, is that it smuggles in so much more that is sort of unstated premises. It smuggles in the existence of God. It smuggles in the idea that humans are in communication with God. It smuggles in the idea that these communications with God are not corrupted. It smuggles in the idea that these people were inherently, let's say, trustworthy. It smuggles in the idea that God isn't untrustworthy. It smuggles in many assumptions that I probably wouldn't even have time to list. So just stating as a first principle a so-called axiom that has buried within it many other principles or assumptions about the universe seems, to put it lightly, questionable. Other than that, I mean, I don't really know what else to say. I mean, anybody, if you're going to assume something like that, I could say, you know, my first principle is, you know, that I'm hearing from, you know, Tinkerbell about the universe. I mean, if you're going to use a first principle, you know, like the one you've just stated, I could use any kind of crazy thing as a first principle and just say, you know, Tinkerbell tells me differently, and that's my first principle, and you're not allowed to really question my first principle because it's my first principle. It's what gets me off the ground. I just don't think that's a reasonable. I don't think it fits within the definition of an axiom or a first principle. But I'll need to look into that more. Like I said, I haven't done too much with the first principle concept as far as researching that. Like I said, it didn't come up when I was studying philosophy in college. So, yeah. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I have a couple of things. I mean, you could claim that Tinkerbell told you different, but that would not. But there wouldn't be really any propositions you could deduce to try and you know. It really wouldn't answer anything about how you know anything. So as a first principle, you know, saying Tinkerbell tells me different would be something that wouldn't be able to adequately answer how you can know things.
The authors of Scripture, they had to learn based on induction and deduction. They had to learn everything they learned based on induction and deduction, did they not? I mean, so the appealing to revelation, when really you're appealing to a source, an outside source in the past that has been, you know, that comes down to us through the annals of history, through various translations and copies, and it's just dubious to try to call that a first principle when it just requires so many other assumptions to get you there. I mean, you may as well appeal directly to God and just cut the Bible out completely, because bringing the Bible into this makes this much more convoluted.
Oh no, I disagree with pretty much everything you said so far.
Oh, okay.
I haven't had an opportunity to respond to it yet, but I disagree.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, it's all right. I mean, I know you're just trying to get your thoughts in. Because I said a lot earlier. Now, as far as what first principle, you say, well, it's not a simple enough axiom. Well, I disagree. I really would like to see how someone would argue that an axiom has to be the most simplest one possible. I mean, like if you were to posit an axiom that's really simple, but it doesn't solve the problem of skepticism, it doesn't answer the question of how you can know things, justifiably, then why are you still going to use it because it's just simple? I mean, we ought to weigh our first principles by how well they solve problems especially in an epistemological light. We need to use axioms that are able to answer the questions of the skeptic, that can stop the infinite regress of the question, how do you know? There's no first principle that I have heard any atheist come up with that can answer those questions. So, if all other presuppositions the atheists put forth fail, then the axiom revelation is a viable solution. And you can try and say, well, it sneaks a lot of these things in. Well, how is someone going to prove that you have to have the most simple axiom in order to try, in order for it to be a valid axiom, if their axioms that they have can't even justify knowledge in the first place? Now that would seem dubious to me.
I was just using the commonly used definition of axioms as they're used in science, for example, which are basic principles that, like you said, are just enough to get you off the ground. They don't make any unwarranted assumptions. The idea is to not assume any more than what's necessary. So, for example, in science, you'd assume that the material world exists and assume that we can use our senses and reasoning and our instruments to learn something about the universe. If you don't assume that the material world is actually there, and if you don't assume that we can learn something about it, then you really can't get off the ground, because you need those basic ideas to do any of the work of science. So this is just a bare minimum. There's just like a few informal or formal axioms. I'm not sure if I've ever seen a list, but those are axioms. Those are just the basic truths you need to get off the ground. An axiom like the material world is real or exists, external to ourselves, is not, it doesn't have within it 1,000 other assumptions like the one of Revelation does, how that brings in so much more. Once you're asserting the Bible, you're asserting many, many other things that had to make the Bible be true and reliable and all this. So,
well, if the Bible's the Word of God, then the contents within the Bible are true. I mean, it just, just like if you assume that the material world exists. Because I think what it is, and I've seen people do this before, whenever I say the Bible is the Word of God, they're saying, well, you're assuming all these other things that the Bible says. You have all these verses. that you're assuming are true. But then when you talk about, well, the external world exists, well, then you're also assuming that that everything that's external to yourself exists. I mean, you know, someone could raise the same objection using the exact same flow of logic to try and object to the material world exists as being too complicated. So, I mean, if the Bible's too complicated because it has all these verses that say all these different things, you know, then it seems to me that the axiom that the material world also exists outside of us would have the same problem because of all the things you're assuming that exist individually.
Well, the Bible is a book. I mean, the thing with axioms, scientific axioms, such as the reality of the external world or our ability to know something about it, those are principles, right? Those are principles. And so the Bible thing, the Bible is a piece of the material world. It's a physical series of words and phrases. And so to use as an axiom the truth of a book doesn't seem legitimate. It doesn't seem legitimate to me. And I know we just have a difference of opinion here. I just don't see that as a valid axiom. I think it's just a huge stretch.
Well, why is it that I mean, but what about the Bible makes it an invalid axiom if it's able to answer questions about how we can know anything at all? I mean, what axiom do you have that's more simple that is able to answer the question of how we can know anything at all? Do you have one?
I think you have to cherry pick the Bible to actually reach that, because you could find many places in the Bible that say things that are wrong, and you could say, well, if you're going to call this an axiom and affirm the truth of this book, then the errors in the Bible undo that axiom. So you'd have to go back to the drawing board, and like I said, you're better off just using God. Just say, I hear from God, and that would I mean, I would disagree with you, but at least it's simple. I mean, at least
God has revealed Himself through Scriptures. That's why I have,
well, according to the Bible. According to the Bible,
yeah, the Bible's the Word of God. That's my axiom.
Well, according to the Bible is God's Word. But that's the problem, is that we haven't gotten there. You're kind of stating it, and instead of doing the work to prove it, this is really where your presuppositionalism hinges. Is instead of demonstrating that the Bible is the Word of God and that God exists, you're calling it an axiom and a first principle, so that you don't have to do the work of showing that it's actually the case.
Well, then how is it if we can't? Okay, we're in the context of rationality here. So, you know, we talked about pragmatism and everything earlier. Now we're in a completely different context of a conversation.
I'm just analyzing what you've said so far, because you hadn't said this until about 10 minutes ago. And so I think that this is the problem with where you're at. This is where I would poke the major holes. I think I have maybe poked a few holes. Is that other versions of presuppositionalism beg the question by just asserting that God, is there, and you're doing that by calling it an axiom. You're just really, the difference in this version from the other version of presuppositionalism is you've relabeled it as an axiom. So I mean, it just doesn't strike me as valid. I mean, Jason, I like you, and if you're a Christian, I think you'll make a good Christian. If you're not a Christian, someday you'll make a good non-Christian. You seem like a genuinely nice guy. I really do have to get going soon. I hope we can do this again.
Absolutely, and if you want to. Just let me, I guess, well, I mean, when you leave, I might just give some thoughts and close it, and then we can talk about, if you look at my stuff, you say, I want to talk about what you said at the end of this video in our next conversation, we can certainly do that. Yeah. And maybe you'll, when you look at some things over, because I've had to do that before too. I've been in conversations where people said stuff that I never heard before, and I had to go research it. I mean, it still happens today.
Absolutely. I've got like maybe one last thing to say is, if anybody watching this, because I saw there were like 15 viewers or something like that, if anybody watches this, heard anything wrong with what I've said, I would really like to hear any kind of corrections. I'm always trying to learn more and refine my knowledge of the external world. I think I've got much more to learn. I think Jason probably would agree with that it's good to just continue learning. So I would really appreciate anyone who can point out flaws in what I've said, because I'm always trying to find those and refine what I'm saying. So thank you to those people who can do that. And to Jason, also, thank you for setting this up and hosting this. You're a gentleman. You're a really nice guy. And that's pretty much it. Do you also, I would like to ask you, would you mind if I mirror this and refer people over to your channel?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can mirror it. I mean, if someone wants to mirror my videos, that's fine. It doesn't bother me. So, especially if you're on the video, that's perfectly fine.
All right. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you later.
All right. No problem, man. Thanks for coming on.
Have a good night.
Too. Yeah, I appreciate Ben coming on, because he said he had a headache, and I really had trouble finding someone who wanted to have a discussion tonight, and probably because it was such short notice. And Ben brought up some point to me, and these are points that I hear a lot, and if Ben watches this video, of course he's welcome to come back and respond to anything I say said about his position. But you know, he said that basically Scripture has too many propositions for it to be axiomatic. It's not simple enough. Well, you know, and he also said that I was begging the question. You know, begging the question isn't really a valid objection for an axiom. You really got to show how it's incoherent in order to destroy the axiom. You know, using logic, the law of contradiction. But you know, it's interesting though, because he said that I was assuming Christianity. But remember what his axiom was, his first principle. Whenever I talked to him originally, it was well, my first principle is that nature is all that exists and the supernatural is false. So he's really, you know, when he revealed his first principle in that conversation, he was assuming the position that God doesn't exist, because obviously the supernatural doesn't exist, and that would certainly rule out God's existence. So I find that to be interesting. I know he was granting the axiom just for the sake of conversation, but I still think that's an interesting position for him to take, while still objecting to me saying that the Bible is the Word of God and it being the first principle. But it's interesting though, because what I was going to bring up to him had he had the time to stay on, is that shoot, I just about forgot what I was going to say. Oh well. Well, what I was going to bring up to him was the fact that there's a cop car here and it's really distracting me. I hope he's not here to arrest me. There we go. Yeah, but anyway, but he, you know, like I said, it's interesting that he appealed to it. You know, he appealed to his naturalistic worldview as his first principle. But you know, the Bible, does lead to a lot of propositions. But you know, what I was going to bring up to him, had he had the time to stay, would be that, well, you know, you know, if other first principles are unable to lead to knowledge, such as reasoning and induction and science, and he's already said that science and induction don't really lead to any absolute knowledge. Well, obviously, if we grant that God exists, then there would be absolute knowledge. There'd be absolute truth. By that I mean immutable, unchangeable, eternal. Those are the three main adjectives I would use to describe truth. It's propositional, and it's true all the time. It never changes. It's an unchanging truth. So when I say absolute truth, that's what I mean. But you know, but if other first principles can't lead to knowledge, then why should we try and use these first principles, such as starting with sense perception, or starting with our own individual reasoning, or starting with pragmatism? You can't prove God through pragmatism. Pragmatism doesn't really prove anything. It just says it just has opinions about what works and what doesn't work. I wouldn't appeal to pragmatism to argue for God's existence. I wouldn't appeal to science to argue for God's existence, because science itself, the way it's logically constructed, is fallacious. And science isn't even truth in the first place. So science could never even prove that God exists or didn't exist. So why would I use science to try and prove that God exists? You know, we have all these different first principles we can choose from, and every single one of them, all the secular first principles, just they lead to skepticism. Sense perception and reasoning is really the only thing a skeptic can appeal to in order to try and justify that anything can be justifiably known. So that's where I would have gone with him had he had the opportunity to stay. And maybe if Ben sees this video, and you know, he'll know what I'm going to say in anticipation for next discussion. If he has to prepare, then he can, you know, prepare. I'm probably going to go ahead and start a separate hangout. I don't want this one to run too long, but just with other people who, you know, people who want to come in and kind of give some opinions. I am going to invite some specific people. I may invite some atheists. You know, we'll just see how it goes. I sort of, when I do these things, I have a specific way I want this to go. I may want Christians in the after discussion, but we'll just see where it goes. And you know, so I'll be posting the next event shortly if anybody wants to continue to watch. Everyone who watched, thanks a lot. And I also want to especially thank Ben for coming on, even though he wasn't feeling too well, and having a discussion. I thought he was a pleasure to talk to. Thanks for watching, guys.